So now working from irregular shapes into shading, it's going to require this. So in order to start this topic, what I want to do is start with a geometric solid. And I've spent a lot of my own time trying to get better at geometric solids. Geometric solids can become the foundation of your drawing. So here's how these things interact with light. If we work with the triangle that we learned the other day for light direction, we can start out in each instance with a cast shadow, and it reaches the ground plane here. It means the light's coming from this direction. Okay, so here's a cast shadow for each of these. And now because the light's coming from this direction, the angle of the shadow, the shape of the shadow will be perfectly perpendicular to that. So if we take an ellipse right here and we draw it around, that will be perpendicular to the light source. On a cube, the side that's away from the light is where we end up with darkness. On a cone and pyramid, so the light's coming in this direction, it goes to the other side, but then it runs straight up and down it. Okay, and here's the light is coming from this direction, so it goes to the other side of the object and runs straight up and down it. Okay, so we've got our cast shadow. Now if we add darkness along the edge of the light, that creates for us a reflected light. So if I darken here, just ever so slightly, that creates a reflected light. If I darken here, ever so slightly, and then here, ever so slightly. Okay, that creates a reflected light. Another really nice piece to add is called the shadow accent, and it's this little piece of dark in here where you have occlusion, meaning just no light gets there at all. It's just this little piece of dark. And then the last phase is to gradate where necessary. So for instance, this is the sphere, and all the transitions are really gentle. So you really have to soften the edge turning towards the light. It really has to soften and turn up towards the light. And if you spend time and make a really soft and beautiful gradation here, it starts becoming very dimensional. It really starts adding a sense of form and dimension. And these will just very gently turn over into the light. And I want to make sure that my reflected light, that everything in my shadow is darker than everything in my lights. And so this too will have these will have gentle transitions. So I'm just sort of carefully, lightly going over those. Okay, so here's my regular shapes and they're all lit. And now I'm gonna, over here, I'm gonna draw an irregular shape and I'm gonna start to light it. So for the rock, I wouldn't recommend necessarily that you start a rock this way, but this is just for the sake of clarity. So here's a cube, and out of the cube, I want to make a triangle face over here, and I want to make a kind of squared face over here, and I want to make a little bit of a round face there. So now here's my rock, and we're going to imagine this rock in the same light as we've been working with. And I'm just casting this shadow based on that triangle. And here's my ground plane. It meets you here, and it meets you here, and it meets you here, and if I wanted to, go over, and it meets you here. Okay, so there's my cast shadow. And cast shadows lighten slightly as they move further from the object. So there's my cast shadow moving further from the object. Okay, here's my shadow accent down underneath this little rock that we've got. Okay, the light direction is coming from the other side. And so I want to fill in this side. And then what I want to do is I want to go through and start to try to address the transitions. Like let's say down here, this part of the rock is a really soft part. Say maybe it's satin water down here. And this part transitions over. And I can also really darken the edge, which will give me my reflected light. And maybe here I want this one to soften. See how this is, I'm going to leave that a little hard right there. And then this is going to soften right there. So right at the edges and corners, this rock seems to have maybe eroded into a state of softness, semi-softness. And I can imagine that like the sphere, that this would have darkness, a little bit of shadow stretching over the way this does. This stuff here could fall into shadow. There could be shadow accent right there. Okay. And we're going to start now, throughout the rest of this lesson, we're going to start to talk about texture. If we're dealing with something like this, imagine that there's a chip out of the rock, like right here. And what would happen is imagine that the chip that comes out of the rock is shaped like a pyramid going inward. Okay, and the light is coming over this way. The light would be kind of catching this side, but disappearing on that side based on its angle. And so here's a chip in this rock. And if I make this part of the chip really dark and that part of it really light, it starts to, it's a kind of convincing textural mark. And I can just, another thing that's really important is allowing your edges to express the texture of an object that you're drawing. And so if I go here and I click these in, I give myself this little bit of texture, like the edge doesn't want to show perfection. It wants to show a kind of, well, it'd be like a perfect rock. That's what the edge wants to show. Okay, so little bits of light can end up in shadows, and little bits of shadow can end up in light based on smaller forms, really, which is what texture is a collection of smaller forms. And then we start to move towards the feeling of really having drawn a rock. And this can be very fun, and you can go from here to freehanding. And now that you have the idea, you can be like, all right, well, here's another rock with a triangle face and a circly top and a square on that side. And its shape is a non-demanding shape. And I'm going to have this side be my shadow side. And I'm going to have this side also be my shadow side. And here's my shadow accent. And the light is coming down this way. And it meets the ground plane there, and it meets the ground plane there, and it meets the ground plane there. So the reflected light, the cast shadow for this guy looks like that. And I'm going to darken the edge. To give myself a reflected light. And over on this part of the rock, right up in here, I want to give myself a really gentle transition into the light. Saying that that part, thinking of that part of the rock as having been smoothed over. I'm going to add a couple of details to the top, like little chunks that have come out of the rock. We'll look for some place on the edge where I can start to add some variety so that it looks more like an object that's had a little bit of life. Okay. Another thing that's really fun to do that can be really good for your drawings is, say I wanted to do another rock over here, but I want to leave a nice big light side so it can catch, the sun is coming down this way. This is like a smaller, flatter rock. This can be the side plane. That can be the side plane. And then it's turning up into the light. But based on the angle of the light, and because this shadow then hits this light part, we end up with an area of nice high contrast, which would become kind of a focal point for us. And this is a really short rock, and its cast shadow is also really nice and short. And here's a little bit of shadow accent in through there, and we can have some details happening. And all right, so that's shading an irregular object.